Dr. Dimick is well known here at at E-Free Church in Hastings as being an advocate for the young earth creation message. Dr. Dimick is a friend of Dr. Sherwin's, who will be presenting tonight, and he will introduce him as we go live with the Great Plains Genesis Forum. Before we welcome Dr. Dimick up, I'd like to just take a moment and pray for the evening. Please join me. Lord, we are grateful for the gift of life. We thank you that you are the creator of the heavens and the earth, and we honor you as such this evening. God, we thank you for the talented folks that have graciously joined in with us to teach us. Lord, I pray that their message and your word specifically goes out in power tonight. Lord, that it would minister to us, that our eyes would be open to new truths, Lord, that are hidden in your word. We do thank you for the opportunity to do this. We thank you for all the work that goes into putting these together, and I pray that this would be a blessed time. Lord, we ask your blessing over this evening, and we pray these things in the precious name of Jesus, our Savior. Amen. Please welcome up Dr. Dimick.
Good evening. It's my pleasure to introduce to you Dr. Frank Sherwin of the Institute for Creation Research. I've known Frank for 24 years now, ever since we worked together on an article for the ICR Acts and Facts, which was mentioned before, a monthly newsletter. And the Acts and Facts has grown over the years from just a little mimeograph sheet to a very top quality color publication now, and it's very good for keeping up with all that's latest in creation science. So just a quick plug for that before we go on. But that was how I got to know Frank Sherwin, and we've been long distance pen pals ever since. Dr. Sherwin he was at Pensacola Christian College teaching for a while. And then he joined ICR and was with them in Southern California. Then when they moved to Dallas, he went with them there. So it's been quite some time. But he has some Nebraska roots too. He went to Hastings College for a year. It wasn't perhaps one of the favorite years of his life. I'll let him tell about that if he wants to. But he did. Well, he did not know the Lord at that time, but he did come to know the Lord while he was working in the military on an aircraft carrier doing jet aircraft repair. So he is a man of many talents, and we just are very glad to welcome him here tonight. I will let him I'll let him introduce his topic, which will have to do with parasites. I should mention too that parasitology has been kind of his specialty area, although he gets into a lot of different areas. He and I share an interest in oceans, but his graduate study was in parasitology at a top quality graduate program at the University of Northern Colorado in Greeley. And he did a lot of field work finding parasites in birds, and he even discovered his own new parasite. So again, I won't steal that thunder, but if he has time and inclination, he can tell you that story too. So without further ado, Dr. Sherwin.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Dr. Dave. I appreciate the introduction. And how are we doing for sound? Sound is good. Okay, what's he that wishes so? My cousin Westmoreland? No, my fair cousin. All right. Sounds good. That's Henry V. I always quote Henry V when I do a sound check. Okay, well, what we're going to talk about this evening and what you see in the title slide is poisons, parasites, predation, and pathogens. And no, it's not the name of a law firm. It's simply the the way that we look at the parasite predator situation there, because that out of all the questions of creation science, it seems, what is this situation with predator prey? I thought God created everything very good. Well, he did. And of course, we have to know something about Christian theology, as going back to the book of beginnings, the book of Genesis, which we're going to do right now. And so we would say that no animals died or were eaten before Adam sinned, as we read about in the premier chapter of the book of Genesis, the book of beginnings. And God said, Behold, I have given you every herb bearing seed, which is upon the face of all the earth, and every tree, in which is the fruit a tree yielding seed. To you it shall be for meat, and to every beast of the earth, and to every fowl of the air, and to everything that creepeth upon the earth, wherein there is life. I have given every green herb for meat, and it was so. So this is what God is telling us after the creation, and it was all very good. At the end of the 6 days, God said it was all very good, and God saw everything that He had made, and behold, it was very good. And the evening and the morning were the sixth day. And so, in this one verse that we just read here this evening, uh, this one verse precludes any interpretation of Genesis which seeks to accommodate the geological ages in its system. The geological ages are identified by the fossils found in the sedimentary rocks of the Earth's crust, which supposedly depict a billion-year history of the evolution of life on Earth. Well, 6 times before this chapter, God has adjudged his work to be good. Now, after completing everything, he declared it all to be exceedingly good. The literal meaning of the Hebrew word rendered very. The evolutionary ages of geology represent a billion years of wasteful inefficiency and profound cruelty if they were indeed part of God's work. They would completely discredit God as the God of order, intelligence, power, grace, and love. Death represents the wages of sin, as Paul says in Romans chapter 6, not of divine love. So, this is the position that the Institute for Creation Research takes in regard to God's very good creation and what happened when our first parents, Adam and Eve, sinned. So, it's plain that both men and animals were originally intended to be vegetarian and herbivorous in their appetites. There was adequate nourishment and energy value available to the fruits and herbs to enable both to accomplish the work God had given them to do. So, this is what God gave us in those opening days of the creation. The question as to how or when some of the animals became carnivorous is not definitely answerable, since the Bible doesn't say. So we can perhaps guess on some of that, but Scripture simply doesn't tell us for sure regarding when carnivorous activity was initiated. And so we have to keep in mind that even today, both animals and men can live on a strictly vegetarian herbivorous diet, as it was in the beginning. Well, we do live in a perfect world that's gone horribly. I think that we would all agree with that. And I had to take a picture of this geothermal pool. Keep your head above water because of the protozoan parasite Naegleria fowleri, which is almost 100% fatal. I won't go into the life cycle. It gets kind of sophisticated, but basically the trophozoite of the parasite migrates up to the cribriform through the cribriform plate into the brain, and that begins to undergo binary fission, and that's the end of that. But if you read at the bottom of the sign there, it says no jumping, diving, splashing, or ducking. And I think maybe they meant dunking. And so donut fame there, but don't dunk anybody in water that you think has Naegleria fowleri. Well, this is a question that people have, as I said just a few minutes ago. What was the function, for example, of this creature you're looking at in God's very good creation? Do you know what that is? Yeah, it's a lamprey. And lampreys are found in the Great Lakes. And so the big question is lamprey an external parasite or is it an active predator? There's kind of a gray area there, but that's a valid question to ask. What was the function of lampreys in God's very good creation? Biblical creationists believe all animals were vegetarian before the fall. Zoologists were not aware that crocodiles routinely eat vegetation, including fruit, not just because meat can be scarce at times, but get this, because they actually enjoy it. I never knew that as a zoologist until fairly recently. Studies of their droppings reveal seeds, grasses, and fruit. And so this is kind of interesting that the crocodiles will eat these kinds of foods just because they enjoy that type of food along with their meat. So meat and vegetables. Alligators grow well on a variety of different diets, including feeds containing inexpensive carbohydrates and plant protein. This was said just a couple of years ago in integrative and comparative biology. And so we find that they grow well and get buff eating containing foods that contain carbohydrates and plant protein. And so the most interesting thing that we have discovered was how frequently it seems extinct crocodiliforms ate plants, according to a doctoral student at the University of Utah just a few years ago. And we find that crocodiles, alligators like to eat these kinds of fruits and vegetables. They hardly partake in this kind of diet, which I would say decades ago it was not well known at all. Dogs and cats like their vegetables as well as we see here. And this seems to us so strange, having been browbeaten that dogs and cats are strict carnivores. They don't eat anything else, and yet we can see this is not the case. And even those who are providing food for dogs, feed stores and all that, are now beginning to realize that it's not just meat, and then they mix in things like yam and other types of vegetables with the feed to give the animals a more balanced diet. Well, scientists have discovered that some sharks are eating a large amount of seagrass as a significant part of their diet. But experts aren't sure why the fish are deviating from their traditional carnivorous diet, according to a writer for National Geographic magazine in 2017. A small coastal shark called the bonnethead shark eats a large amount of seagrass. And then look at this. I thought this was interesting and has adaptations in its digestive system to process vegetation, according to new research. This is according to Science News 2018. Well, I, as a zoologist, am very interested in this because I like to study sharks and the parasites of sharks. And it's fun to separate out the parasites from the GI tract of a shark because God has designed sharks, a typical squalus, with what is called a spiral valve. And you look at the GI tract and you cut open the portion of the stomach there and expose the spiral valve. And, you know, it is just amazing the construct of that valve. In other words, when you use an auger to cut holes in the ice or to cut holes for post holes, you have that special auger, the way it's designed. It looks just the same in what they call the spiral valve of the shark. And there's a number of parasites that are unique to the GI tract of the shark, and they attach themselves onto the spiral valve. And so, when I was a graduate student, we would cut up a spiral valve and then put it in a solution of formalin and then shake the daylights out of it, and that would cause the parasites, and of course they were long since dead, but their rose hook thorns would detach from the spiral valve. And we could do some more investigation, like Paracristinella is a genus name of some of these parasites of sharks. Moving right along. The researchers gathered, documented numerous examples from the literature of, if you can believe this, spiders eating plant food. According to their systematic review, spiders from 10 families have been reported feeding on a wide variety of different plant types, such as trees, shrubs, weeds, grasses, ferns, or orchids. They also show a diverse taste when it comes to the type of plant food. Nectar, plant sap, honeydew, leaf tissue, pollen, and seeds are all on the menu. And this is back in 2016. So spiders that we traditionally think of, these arachnids, as being totally carnivorous, are actually eating a more, if I can use the phrase, a more balanced diet. Who would have guessed? Well, and then there was the curse. We're looking at this, and then we realize we understand what Scripture says regarding the curse is the ground for thy sake. In sorrow shalt thou eat of it all the days of thy life. Then, verse 18, thorns also and thistles shall it bring forth to thee, and thou shalt eat of the herb of the field. And so we have thorns and thistles that are a result of God cursing the earth because of the sin. If you remember the progression there in the opening chapters of Genesis, we have the creation in Genesis chapter 1, followed by the corruption of the creation. Genesis chapter 3 and verse 1, when Satan said to Eve, the very first words out of Satan's mouth is to question God's authority. You remember what he said in verse 1? Yea, hath God said. Adam and Eve were beguiled. That's the corruption of the creation. And then, as we see here in Genesis chapter 3, later on in the chapter, God cursed the earth with weeds and thorns and thistles and so forth. And so this also probably includes, and I'm going to go out on a limb here a little bit, because of course, Scripture doesn't say anything about parasites, nor does it say anything about mutations. But we think probably when God cursed the earth with weeds and thorns and thistles, he probably that was the introduction to parasites and genetic mistakes, lesions of the DNA molecule in our cells. And so we have parasites, mutations, and definitely telemarketers as well. And so we find that these are the, thank you, thank you. And so this is part of the curse. All right. So it was good in the original creation. Many currently pathogenic, that is, disease causing microbes and viruses, may have possessed a function that was actually helpful or beneficial. We can put it another way. Could parasites and disease causing bacteria, that is, after the fall of Adam, be slight genetic variations from the very good ancestors that we see in the pre fall world? These are valid questions to ask if we adhere to the biblical model of creation and the corruption and the fall and God cursing the earth. And so creation scientists suggest that the disease causing bacteria and parasites of today were, in fact, beneficial or at least neutral in the pre fallen world. Consider the sometimes pathogenic but otherwise beneficial bacteria in our large intestine, that is, Escherichia coli. And I used to teach a lot about E. coli at Pensacola Christian College in the late 80s and into the 90s there. And we all know that E. coli helps to synthesize vitamin K, which helps in the clotting of blood. It's not an actual clotting factor, but it does help in the clotting of blood. Those who, well, I won't get into that. And then also, E. coli inhabits these micro niches within the GI tract. And because E. coli is there first, then the pathogenic bacteria can't get in there. And so E. coli helps to maintain the balance of normal intestinal flora. Well, it's much easier to damage or make defective an existing function than it is to build a new one. For example, the original benign, good, or neutral function for disease causing bacteria. And so it's easier to damage or at least make defective the original function than it is to try and explain how it all came about from basically nothing. So this is one of my favorites. Tetrodotoxin, TTX, is a potent neurotoxin that we find, for example, in pufferfish, but it's also found in some other animals as well. The benefits of TTX include an analgesic. It's an actual painkiller, a prevention for ischemic damage after a stroke, and it may also be used as an anesthetic. And so this is kind of interesting how technology and how science can look at some of these negative things like TTX and make something good out of it, as it were. For example, Harvard Medical School in 2019 did an investigation, a search for opioid alternatives, explores pufferfish venom for precise painkilling. Well, who would have guessed? And so that's kind of interesting. And a lot of Japanese diners every year die of tetrodotoxin poisoning they get from pufferfish because pufferfish is eaten raw in the strips of the flesh. And an individual who prepares the fish has to be uh, granted a license from the government in order to do the preparation technique because if you do it wrong, you get poisoned and die. People who have experienced close brushes with death by eating the raw pufferfish of this TTX, they first experience that their lips go numb and then their tongue goes numb. And fortunately, they managed to pull through. But this would indicate that it might be an effective painkiller. Moving right along, what about snake venom? In his book, The Material Basis of Evolution, geneticist Richard Goldschmidt offered a challenge to his evolutionary colleagues to explain the origin, and there's the key word, origin of the poison apparatus of snakes by way of an accumulation of microevolutionary changes. Maybe you've heard, I know I've heard it a lot in my career with creation science. Evolutionists tell us that macroevolution is nothing more than minor changes writ large, and that accumulation of minor changes gives you macro evolutionary changes. That is quite wrong. Evolutionists now, such as this guy Trevor Palmer out of England, in his 1999 book, he went out of his way to say no, small changes do not lead to large changes, and he was no creationist. And so the poison apparatus of these snakes is quite sophisticated and, of course, quite effective as well. And Goldschmidt's challenge to his evolutionary colleagues has never been answered at all. Well, venom is used for killing prey, obviously, for defense and to assist with digestion of their prey. I didn't know that. I just thought it was do a number on the animal that the snake is eating. But we could ask the question as creationists, could this also aid the digestion of vegetable matter? The origin of snake venom and of snakes too has become more puzzling to evolutionary proponents, not less puzzling. In other words, the more they delve into the poison apparatus, the production of venom, and where snakes come from in the first place, there it is more of an evolutionary enigma. Biologist and paleontologist Ed Michael Denton, in his 2015 book, have debated the origin of snakes for more than a century. And he said the debate is far from resolved. Well, we understand the origin of species from a biblical perspective, but for example, with evolutionists, they certainly don't know the origin of snakes or basically any group of animals for that matter. There are efforts to develop drugs based on venom, an area that has already shown benefit in cardiovascular disease and could prove important in the treatment of pain and neurological disorders, as well as other human diseases, according to an individual named Gibbs, and as reported in the Ohio State News just a few years ago. And so here's ways I wouldn't suggest doing this, by the way. Please don't try this at home. And I know right there in Nebraska, in the Hastings area, you've got snakes, but try not to do this because it probably wouldn't work out too well. But anyway, um, poisons. What about poisons? And we've already touched on that, I think. But the effort involved working with botulinum neurotoxins, which are widely known to be toxic under some circumstances and therapeutic under others. And so that's kind of interesting. They can present as botulism, for example, a well kind of food poisoning that we've all heard about. And it's very, very toxic. Very small amount can lead to many, many deaths if it's unchecked. but they also are used for other forms to make Botox. And we're all familiar people going to these Botox parties and getting these micro injections to get rid of crow's feet and everything else, which is used to treat migraines as well as cosmetic therapies. And so again, a silver lining to this cloud of neurotoxin that we call botulism. Listeria becomes nasty when starved of oxygen, reported Eureka Alert, which is an evolutionary science publication online. Quote, limiting oxygen produces bacteria up to 100 times more invasive than similar bacteria grown with ample oxygen supplies. Could this imply that a world with different atmospheric or soil conditions could have been less prone to disease? A valid question. We can ask that question. And that's what science is all about, asking questions, doing the research, formulating hypotheses and theories. Creationists can do that just as well as evolutionists. Could the bacteria we fear most have been or even beneficial in such an environment? And so these are good, and as I say, valid questions to ask from a creation science perspective. Cholera. Well, the pathology of cholera results from a defective regulation of the AC, the adenyl cyclase, and overproduction of the second messenger, cyclic AMP. And I learned about that back in California when I took uh, two classes uh, where we studied the G protein gated receptors in molecular pharmacology. And so it was very, very interesting to study this. Uh, Vibrio cholera causes the human intestinal disease cholera. And so it can be very toxic, but once again, there's a silver lining to this. What if, prior to the fall, this toxin had an alternative function? A good question to ask. A very similar toxin is produced by Vibrio fischeri, a curious light-emitting symbiotic bacteria that is found in the Hawaiian bobtail squid. There's one individual at the University of Wisconsin, she's not a creationist. She said, maybe when we've been studying cholera pathogenesis, we've been studying an aspect of a normal conversation that's gone wrong. Now, basically, this species of bacteria, Vibrio fischeri, that's ensconced within the Hawaiian bobtail squid, actually has communication abilities with the squid itself. It's fascinating. Dr. Brian Thomas has written an article about this. You can check it out at icr.org. I think I've also written an article about this as well. But we're looking at, I think there's only one amino acid difference between the very pathogenic strain and what we see here with the Hawaiian bobtail squid. And so again, we're seeing something that has been corrupted, we believe, by the fall, which began with something that was quite good in the ecosystem, the oceanic ecosystem. Well, on to my favorite subject, and Dr. Dimick was so correct about that, parasitology. And I found as I study parasites, you don't have to go to France to study parasites. Thank you. And so sushi still your best bet for intestinal worms. All right, this is this is not an actual billboard, but it's okay. I went ahead and put it up there anyway because you'll never catch me eating sushi. But, and I do love to eat seafood. This is the textbook that I studied as a graduate student at the University of Northern Colorado in the mid 1980s. David mentioned that taught at I taught at Pensacola Christian College, but before that, I got my master's at UNC, and before that, I was a city firefighter for 5 years in Greeley. But this is the book that Dr. Gerald D. Schmidt, as you can see on the title, the author there, wrote along with Larry Roberts. Both of these men have since passed away. Dr. Schmidt was my major advisor, and I met Larry Roberts at several parasitology conferences, specifically one in Utah but it was a joy to do the research and investigation. And I shot about 35 tree swallows up in the mountains of Colorado. And as Dave mentioned, I was able to find a new species of a nematode. Nematodes are roundworms of those small white worms that you find in your cat and your dog sometimes. But uh, I found a new species of nematode, and so I decided to name it after my wife. And my wife, unfortunately, threatened domestic violence. And so I kind of had second thoughts about that. Now, I wanted to get her name in the literature, not because it was a parasite, but I just wanted to get her name in the literature, as you can see up there, the Journal of Parasitology, which I'm sure is up in your coffee table next to Reader's Digest and a few others. But uh, she said no, she didn't want her name as a parasite, so I named it Acuaria Acuaria coloradensis, because I found it in Colorado. I want to name it Acuaria janifeltii because Janice Felty was my wife's maiden name, but as I say, she said no. And so Acuaria coloradensis, and there's the research there. Okay, a parasite is a type of a symbiont, that is, dissimilar organisms living together in close association. And we have, this is just biology 101 that you had in high school, obligate parasites and facultative parasites, and there are the definitions. Um, the challenge of parasitology is listed by Locher and Hofkin, who are evolutionists writing in a parasitology text just a few years ago. And they said opinions vary on how to define some of the key aspects of parasites and their biology, that is, their life cycle. And so here we are, just decades and decades since the research first began in earnest regarding parasitology. But if you have an evolutionary worldview, it's always going to be somewhat frustrating. Here's a roundworm and hookworm, but roundworms and hookworms are basically the same thing. They're both worms there. And then nematodes, well, they're kind of a roundworm as well. And so it's kind of hard to, in some respects, to classify these, but they're very, very unique creatures. Um, is parasitism bad? Okay, since we're talking about poisons and pathogens and parasites and so forth, uh, Luther said, and he's no creationist, believe me, he said, and I quote, parasitism usually implies that some harm is done to the host, such as you see with this hookworm here. But this interpretation must be qualified. Effects on the host range from almost none to severe illness and eventual death. And so this is hookworm and Cyclostoma duodenale, which was endemic in the southern part of the United States back in the 1900s, early 1900s, when nobody wore any shoes and they were running around where people might have defecated there just a couple hours to a couple of days earlier, and they were infected with uh, the the hookworm, and then the hookworms embryonate in the soil, and the life cycle propagates in that way. Continuing on with this quote from the Oxford Dictionary of Zoology, Allaby says, but even where such obvious immediate harm accrues to the individual host, it does not follow that the relationship is harmful to the host species in the long term. So I thought that was an interesting admission for this guy, Allaby, to make. As I say, he's no creationist, and this is said very recently. So what is it that causes such debilitating situation with people who have parasites? A lot of people think it's a parasite themselves, but that's kind of a secondary thing. It's really how our designed immune system is responding to the parasitic infection. And so, in parasitic conditions, there often is limited pathology directly attributable to the organism. Most morbidity is related to the immunoinflammatory response of the host to the parasite. And so people get devastated by this immunoinflammatory response as the body reacts to the parasitic infection there. This is what does a lot of damage. And I think, for example, schistosomiasis that occurs with people waiting water in the Middle East, and they use that same waterway as their toilet, and you get one of three different kinds of schistosoma, hematomium japonicum, for example. Those are the two of the three species that people can get, and it really sets up a very significant immunoinflammatory response to the ova or the eggs that are shed by the female in the venules of an individual based on the species. Well, were parasites in their original form beneficial? That's a good question to ask from a creationist. The evolutionist is a no-show. They simply not even consider this type of question because they are locked into their evolutionary worldview. But we would say yes, parasites in their original form very probably were beneficial. We have to be careful that we don't speak too dogmatically because we weren't there. And scripture doesn't have too much to say at all, for example, about parasites. And so we have to use a lot of theoretical science in order to come to, I think, would be a basic answer to a question such as that. This is a little bit of a long quote, but my friend Dave, who said this, I want to share it with you because he is out in California, and he has done a very good job in kind of setting this up. He said, consider mutualistic interactions. Each organism benefits from the other. Examples are the yucca moth and cleaner fish. Stop right there, cleaner fish. That is an amazing mutualistic relationship between large predatory fish and smaller fish and shrimp that swim into the jaws of death of these larger fish who were swimming up, getting in line, and waiting for these cleaner creatures, either fish or shrimp, to clean out their mouth, to clean the portions of their body from external parasites and internal parasites. And when they start picking off of these parasites, it's got to hurt a little bit. And yet these large fish will allow these cleaner fish and cleaner shrimp to clean. And then once they're done, they don't try and eat the cleaner fish. They swim away looking for smaller fish and shrimp to eat. So that's an amazing relationship there. Darwinism fails to explain these finely tuned interactions. Perhaps our categories are too simplistic. We often put viruses in the bad category since they invade a host cell and use its machinery to make copies of themselves. Why then do only a fraction of viruses cause disease? Good question. What are the others doing? Many of them kill bacteria. Well, we call them bacteriophages, and that's good, isn't it? You bet it's good. Maybe we should take a look afresh. In biology, there are many pushes and pulls. Pushes and pulls are not good or bad. They are opposite forces that maintain homeostasis. Well, if you study anatomy and physiology, one of the key words you'll run into over and over again is homeostasis. And so I think this is a good quote, and I had to include the whole thing. Well, I mentioned bacteriophages, and the world's oceans have untold trillions upon trillions of bacteriophages floating in the ocean and infecting bacteria that are reproducing by the bushel basket every 24 hours. And so the creator, in his incredible planning, has planned there to be a balance between bacteriophages, that is, viruses designed to infect bacteria, and the bacteria themselves. As a matter of fact, almost all known bacteria have a specific predatory bacteriophage, and that points, I think, very clearly to a balanced ecosystem. This is an electron micrograph that's been falsely colorized, showing an E. coli cell. We mentioned E. coli earlier, and look at all of those T-even, they call them T-even bacteriophages, infecting the E. coli cell. Well, this is what's going on every microsecond of every day in the world's oceans. Because if there was no bacteriophages, the oceans would be overwhelmed in a very short order with a lot of bacteria, and you know what that would lead to. And yet the creator in his infinite wisdom has designed the bacteriophages to work with, or as it were, with the bacteria. So they are of ecological importance. They're essential in preventing bacterial population explosions in the world's oceans. And so this is a diagram here. We don't have time for me to go through it here, but I think it again is, I think, evidence, very clear evidence of God's balanced ecosystem. Well, after the fall, some creation zoologists suggest that free living creatures became parasitic. And this is the camp that I pretty much subscribe to. I think that before God cursed the earth, you had a lot of these soon to be parasites, which were simply free living worms in the environment. They weren't harming anything. And then parasitic species have retained some of the morphological, that is, the physical resemblance with their free living counterparts. And I thought this was an interesting quote from Poulin, who is not a creationist, and yet I think that this is something that we can pay attention to as we attempt to describe the origin of parasites from God's very good creation. In fact, free living species could become parasitic without substantial anatomical or physiological changes. Well, bingo. I mean, this is exactly what creation scientists have been saying. This is what I've been saying for a couple of decades. And this quote is from two evolutionists writing in a university zoology textbook. And one of the creatures that I like to study as a parasitologist is Strongyloides stercoralis. And unless you're directly involved in parasitology or anything like that, you probably never heard of this. It's quite a devastating parasite. It's very small, but what's unique about Strongyloides stercoralis is that it has a free living stage, but also it has a parasitic stage. And so under the wrong conditions, somebody who consumes the ova, the eggs of Strongyloides, then it hatches within the individual, and the otherwise free living worm then becomes parasitic. And so it kind of bridges the gap between free living parasites, free living creatures taking on an overt parasitic existence given the right environment. And so thus within the suborder Tylonychia, one can observe completely free living species, facultative parasites, obligate parasites, and even species that produce free living or parasitic populations. Look at this, depending on environmental conditions. And so here, once again, is a key to perhaps answering the question of the origin of parasites. The people who said this, the two authors, are Larry Roberts. Larry Roberts was an invertebrate zoologist out of Texas, and Genovi, writing in 2013 in Foundations of Parasitology. When I was a graduate student, I studied the second edition, and now they're up to the ninth edition. I think they're up to the 11th edition now. And so I thought this was a gold mine of a quote, because this is what creation scientists who are parasitologists basically have been saying. Not all creation parasitologists agree, but this certainly gives us food for thought. Having millions of parasites living in your gut may actually be a benefit if you also have multiple sclerosis. And so this came out of BBC News, no friend of the creationist, in 2007. And I had a dear friend of mine who's now has gone to be with the Lord, but he had MS. And so I began to read up about this and read that the methods used by the creatures to stop our immune systems wiping them out could be keeping the illness at bay. So that's kind of interesting how that would work out there. And in the Annals of Neurology, study found that the parasite-riddled group had far fewer multiple sclerosis relapses. The infected patients were infested with a variety of different species, including tapeworms, that is, cestodes, nematodes, whipworms, and pinworms. So this is, I think, kind of interesting to see how some of this plays out from a biblical parasitology perspective. A recent theory provides several possible explanations for such neutral to positive effects of stomach nematodes on host fitness. Neutral to positive. Well, that's something that you really don't read too much about when it comes to parasitology, but the more research it is done, it seems that this seems almost to be the norm now. And so this is a very, very fascinating discovery, and it just looks better and better for the creation parasitologist. However, predation enhances the regenerative capabilities of the coral colony such that the total effect of parasitism on the coral colony's fitness may be positive. And so we're looking at a very large ecosystem here. We're looking at the oceanic, the reef community, and seeing that there seems to be beneficial effects on that on a very large scope. So this is all I think is very, very interesting, and as we begin to think outside the box, as it were, about the nature of parasites, what they do, and what they probably were prior to the fall. So let's look at parasites from an evolutionary non-explanation. Now, evolutionists have their explanations, as it were, and it's not very satisfactory, but just take a look at what they have to say. Almost all the traditional generalizations about parasite evolution are myths. This is not a creationist who said this. This is Brooks and McClellan writing a very foundational book on parasitology. Parasitic evolution are myths, metaphors, and misconceptions unsupported by data and based on a lack of robust analytical method for reconstructing evolutionary history. Wow. And I wish I had read this when I was in graduate school. Parasite evolution, myths, metaphors, and misconceptions. A fascinating, fascinating read. This Parascript it's just an incredible book. Um, the biological processes that characterize host-parasite interactions rely on a multitude of cascading biochemical reactions that involve chemically different molecules such as DNA, RNA, and proteins. And so we find there's nothing simple about these cascading effects. And of course, this is something else that is I think, evidence of creation, and especially in terms of medical microbiology and so forth. So there's no way that you can see in the diagram something like that could evolve by time and chance. Um, this comes from an older textbook, but I had to include it because Asa Chandler was quite the parasitologist in their day. Quote, it would be difficult, if not impossible, to explain step by step the details of the process of evolution by which some of the highly specialized parasites reach their present condition. And the reason why I include this quote, as old as it is because it's certainly true in the 21st century, as it was back in the 20th century when this quote was stated. And it's a major challenge. Schmidt-Hempel said in 2011, hence, tempo and mode of post-parasite co-evolution at the macroevolutionary scale remains a major challenge to understand. This is a great quote because it's recent, 2011. And so it's a major challenge to understand the macroevolution of parasites. And here is Brooks from that book, Parascript, that I mentioned. He said, as a consequence, we have little understanding of the similarities and differences between, for example, parasite host and insect plant systems at either the microevolutionary or macroevolutionary scale. And I mentioned earlier about microevolution not leading up to macroevolution. The two are in total disconnect. We can observe microevolutionary changes. I don't like that word. I like to say variation within the created kind. But macroevolution, meaning big change, has never been observed, either in the laboratory, out in the field, or in the fossil record. Macroevolution is a no-show. And nobody has ever observed it because it never happened. So here's the book, Periscript. It was published in 1993. And these two secular authors admitted, and I salute them this evening, they admitted that parasites are still a puzzle. Well, they were a puzzle in 1993 when these two very outstanding evolutionists said this, but it's also true today. In 2015, these two secular authors, Locher and Hofkin, said macroevolutionary patterns among parasites are not yet very clear. Well, I would like to make a prediction this evening and say that it will never be very clear because macroevolution has never happened. It has never happened. We don't see it going on anywhere in the three places I mentioned. And so, not to denigrate the evolutionists, that's not the purpose of ICR, but they simply don't know. And they will never know the macroevolution of parasites because it never happened. The platyhelminths are one of my favorite groups of parasites, the flatworms, such as the Digeneid trematodes that I was talking about earlier, the bilharziasis, as they call it, that occurs in fresh water in the biblical events a while back. Evolutionists can only appeal to hypothetical relationships among parasitic platyhelminthes. The key word there, of course, is hypothetical. And again, I'm not making fun or denigrating, but it will always be hypothetical because we don't find one kind of parasite that you see there, like the cestodes, evolving from a common ancestor that would also be for example, you see the aspidogastria there. Those are parasites that parasitize the bladder of turtles, of all things. Turbellaria, Digeneid trematodes, and the monogenids, and so forth. For example, the evolutionary origins of the Digenea have been debated for some time, for decades and decades. And they'll never come to a consensus because, again, macroevolution doesn't work. The life cycles certainly are complex. This is a diagram from the Center for Disease Control. Poulin said in his second edition of his book, The Evolutionary Ecology of Parasites, complex life cycles remain one of the most baffling features of parasites, and there is still much to be learned about their evolution. Well, granted, the life cycles are very complex, but they did not evolve. And so there's work to be done in that, again, from a creation science perspective. Evolutionists ignore Genesis chapter 1. Therefore, they can't explain the ingenious life cycles of parasites, such as what you see here with the Cercaria from the Digeneid trematodes. And I just have to say something here. I know we're out of time. And would somebody unplug the clock there in Hastings? Just unplug it for me. Good. Thank you very much. Okay, now I have some more time. But when you talk about the physiology of the parasite, it is absolutely amazing because what you see here is the intermediate stage. There's intermediate stage of the parasite. It takes place in a snail. Well, the snail's physiological environment is very, very different from the final host, which would be a mammal, such as it could be any one of the mammals, or it could even be a person. And so when the parasite is developing in the snail host, you have a different pH, you have a different concentration of sodium, potassium, you have a different concentration of oxygen and carbon dioxide, a different temperature. Everything is different. And yet this one parasite is able to adapt to that environment. Then it becomes from a metacercaria, it becomes a cercaria. It's shed by the snail, and this cercaria, very, very small entity, goes out into fresh water. Well, the fresh water is quite different from the snail. Fresh water has a different pH, isotonicity. It has different carbon dioxide and oxygen levels. And everything about it is different from the snail. Well, the cercaria only has enough ATP energy to find its definitive host, be it a waterfowl like a duck or a person, depending on the species, and they have to penetrate the person, for example, by way of a hair follicle. They shed the tail, and these cercaria are called Furcocerca cercaria. They shed the tail, and the cercaria then penetrates by way of the hair follicle, getting into the capillary bed underneath the skin. All of a sudden, we have a third very different environment. Now, this same parasite has to contend with an immune system, and we have macrophages and various other entities within the immune system, such as antibodies, which have to this parasite has to contend with. You have a different pH, different carbon dioxide and oxygen levels, at different temperature. All of this is quite different, and this entity, this one cercaria, has to adapt itself virtually immediately in order to contend with a brand new set of biochemical challenges. So I think it's evidence of creation. We obviously don't have all the answers there, but I can't see something like this, the adaptability of this one, for example, cercaria, being able to adapt so rapidly and so exquisitely, and it's just a challenge. Hickman and four other authors, five evolutionists, said among the world's most amazing biological phenomena are digeneid life cycles. And that's just what I talked about the last 3 minutes here. The digeneid trematode, which cercaria is a shining example of that one part of the digeneid life cycle. Well, there were creation scientists active in research in the past, such as Surgeon Major Ronald Ross. He was a strong believer. He loved the Lord. And he was sent by the U.S. Army to the South Pacific to investigate and research the life cycle of malaria. It's like a good detective novel. If you're interested in tracing out the life cycle of malaria from a historical narrative, I would urge you to do that. You will not be disappointed. It's an amazing process. And so much of the credit goes to this individual you see there, Surgeon Major Ronald. I wish I had time, I don't, but basically he set up his 10x microscope, just a little microscope with a 10 times magnification. I can't believe you can see anything just magnified 10 times, and yet he was able to do that. He would be sitting under a kerosene lamp, and all these mosquitoes would be around, just buzzing at him, trying to bite him as he was trying to watch something that we call in parasitology exflagellation. It has to do with the stomach lining of the female Anopheles mosquito. And again, I don't have time to go into detail except to say that as he was sitting there and his perspiration was dripping down and it rust the gears of the microscope, making it difficult to turn, and so he could focus, he was able to see exflagellation process as it occurred in the stomach line of the female Anopheles. Well, the mosquito is a little bit of nothing, and how he's able to see that is just an amazing, amazing ability. And so when he saw what happened, he realized that he himself had found the last piece of the puzzle of a malaria life cycle. So what did he do? He sat down that evening and he penned these words. It's amazing that people could write this way. And it wasn't too awfully long ago. But here's what he said. When he saw that process, he knew that he had finally put in the last piece of the jigsaw puzzle. Here's what he said. This day, relenting God hath placed within my hand a wondrous thing. And God be praised. At this command, seeking his secret deeds, with tears and toiling breath, I find thy cunning seeds, O million murdering death. So that's the way they spoke in those days. But Surgeon Major Ronald Ross, a strong believer who believed that in the beginning God created, and I believe God honored his commitment by giving him this ability. Moving right along, speaking of mosquitoes, mosquitoes are an important food source for fishes, birds, lizards, and salamanders. Males feed on nectar and therefore help to pollinate flowers. And so I talk to people, and they say, if only Noah had bashed the two mosquitoes as they got on board the ark, we wouldn't have that problem. But there's a silver lining to mosquitoes, and we can see it right here. Males feed on nectars, helping to pollinate flowers. The larvae of the mosquitoes feed on waste products, making nutrients available, such as nitrogen, which is a critical part of the whole ecosystem. And we've all heard of the nitrogen cycle and so forth for the plant community. Well, epizootic, um, oh boy, it's a non-parasitic animal that attaches themselves to outer surface of other animals. And we're kind of out of time right now, but I just want to finish just one or two slides and then we'll be done, I promise. This is the acanthocephala, the thorny-headed worms. Out of all the parasites, I suppose the acanthocephala is one of my favorites. They look wicked, and fortunately, people don't really get infected by acanthocephala. Looking at the apical portion of that, you're kind of glad that you don't get infected with that. This serves as an indication that early acanthocephalans, that is, the thorny-headed worms, lived epizootically or as ectoparasites on arthropods before their complex life cycle with arthropod intermediate and vertebrate definitive hosts evolved. And so there seems to be a connection, maybe with epizootic infections there, that maybe these creatures had an epizootic existence prior to becoming full-fledged parasites after the fall. God cursed the earth. So our conclusion, and we're done. The curse in Genesis accounts for the existence of parasites, poisons, predation, and pathogens. We see much evidence that confirms that the world was made perfect, but that sin corrupted God's very good creation. Clearly, there are details that require research, and I would like to add, folks, that we are Institute for Creation Research. Okay, so we don't have all the answers. That's why we're now called the Institute for Creation Answers. But their details that require research, but creation fits the big picture, not Darwinian. So, Dave, that's all I have, my friend.
Where else are you going to find a guy so passionate about parasites? Thank you, Dr. Sherwin. Very cool. Really interesting stuff. Would like to open it up for some questions. If we have questions here in the live audience, as well as if you're online, feel free to post those on the YouTube channel, and we'll try to get those answered for you. So let's open it up. Does anyone have a question here? I think we've got a microphone headed your way, sir. Oh, there we go.
Yes, I was curious about your early comments on the venom and how it was had a useful benefit. I was down close to you in Glen Rose a number of years back, and when they had the research on the magnetic fields, and among other things, somehow they came off with the hypothesis. Oh, you have to put it right on your mouth.
Yeah, you do. Wow.
The hypothesis was that magnetic fields kind of acts as a deterrent. I don't know if that's the right word. Against, it neutralizes the potency of the venom as far as a destructive entity. And could you make any comments on that?
Well, if I'm following, I'm not sure if I follow completely, but you have to remember venom is just a biological molecule, just like anything else, just like, for example, various kinds of enzymes and all that. And so it would be very, very selective. And that's what I'm kind of uncomfortable about, is that why would it just affect the venom and not some of these other biomolecules, of which are legion in number? And so that's always been, I think, my hang up as a scientist, as, why just the venom? Why is that neutralized and not, for example, biochemicals in the eye, for example, or something else? So I just kind of, I'm a little bit diffident about that. I just kind of have to step back and uh, I would need some more evidence.
All right. Any other questions here? Got one over here, sir.
Dr. Sherwin, you talked a little bit about balanced ecosystems.
Mhm.
And is it your view that possibly God created originally good parasites, but also we needed some parasites that would do damage to balance an ecosystem in a world that's damaged by sin? Does that question make sense?
It makes very good sense, my friend. Yeah, I think you're onto something. It has to do with something called mutualism. For example, you heard me talk about Escherichia coli, which lives in our colon. Our colon provides, and E. coli only makes up about 1% of our total, what we call our microbiome within the colon. Um, but our colon provides food and moisture and shelter to the E. coli. E. coli, in turn, produces, for example, vitamin K, and it helps to set up and establish a niche within our colon. So uh, pathogens cannot take up that niche because the E. coli is already there, that type of thing. Could that not also be included with, for example, protozoa, which are single-celled animals, or even metazoa, which are worms or something like that? Could they not have had a residence in the human body or the body of animals and have this mutualistic interaction writ large? And so that's a question to ask. And I think there might be something to that when God cursed the earth. Some of these mutualistic creatures that may have lived in harmony with humans or animals took on this parasitic existence. I think, for example, with the Naggleria fowler, which is so devastating. And by the way, I don't want to detract anybody from going swimming in freshwater lakes because the chances of you getting Naggleria fowleri are about equal with you winning the lottery. Okay, but at the same time, um, there are other, for example, the Entamoeba histolytica, which is an amoeba, and you know, that also has neutral effects, and but then sometimes can be very devastating. A homosexual population has a very big problem with Entamoeba histolytica. This particular parasite is spread by ways that I won't go into because it's well, I'm not going into it except that these protozoa secrete a proteolytic enzyme. And if they get through the GI tract and into the blood, they can go to the brain, they can go to the liver, and cause serious abscessing and death. And so this is a corruption of God's creation. So I think maybe protozoan creatures, now they're parasites, I think maybe they had a more beneficial effect. And so I think that's a very good question, and that's something we're looking into.
Great questions. Any others? One right over here.
Yes, sir. Rod Gooden here. These two questions are not really scientific, but this is my thought. Is it possible that the scientists now that are beginning to say that tigers are living on, alligators are living on vegetables and fruits and stuff, and all the other animals, snakes and so on? Is that a sign of our times, just to try to promote that, hey, we can all live just on vegetables and we don't need meat anymore? Well, that's a cultural issue. And then second is the animals and Adam and Eve were eating plants. Isn't that death to the plants?
Yeah, that's a good question there. We understand that probably plants are not alive in the biblical sense, if I understand your question. Uh, God breathed into animals the breath of life, or breathed into Adam and Eve the breath of life, and all. But he didn't say that regarding plants. And so plants, although they metabolize and reproduce, they don't have what people and animals have. And so they simply plants are not alive in the biblical sense. But me, there's nothing I like more than a triple cheeseburger. And so I can hear the smaller arteries of my heart slamming shut as I eat that triple cheeseburger. But I mean, those things are so delicious. And so, yeah, I try and eat a whole lot more of the fresh fruits and vegetables, lots of fiber, statins, things such as that. And, we do read about how much longer people live who are vegetarian, and there's something to that. But uh, yeah, in the beginning there, everybody was a vegetarian, and I like to share with people one of my favorite bats is a bat in the South Pacific that has some of the most wicked looking dentition that you've ever seen in a creature. These teeth of this particular bat, just look terrible. Just slice and dice and all that. And sure enough, they use that dentition, they use those teeth to slice and dice into guavas, papayas, mangoes. They're the South Pacific fruit bat. They have about a 6 foot wingspan. But the reason why God designed the dentition that way is if you look at the husk on a lot of these fruits and everything else, it's very difficult to penetrate. But God has provided uh, the that with its own dentition in order to get through that husk and so forth. And they do just quite fine. They do just great eating vegetables and mostly fruits their entire life.
All right.
If I could comment on what you asked, Rod, about meat and its importance or unimportance. Years ago, I went to a hematology conference and we had a session about iron deficiency anemia, which is a huge worldwide health problem, especially among people who have a cultural or a religious taboo against eating red meat. Now, I know red meat has been bashed up one side and down the other unceasingly in our media, and there's just a lot of bad mouthing of red meat. But the fact is, it's a really good. You have to balance that out with the fact that yes, it does have some effects that may not be so good. Of course, if people exercised more, those bad effects might be lessened considerably too. But it's hard. It's just very difficult to go out and have an entirely plant diet and get all the nutrients that you need. Not only iron but also B12 and folate. Difficult to have an all-plant diet that will give you what you need to have a healthy red blood cell supply. So that's a good thing to keep in mind too.
Yeah. Yeah, and of course, it's very important with the amino acids. You've got several amino acids that are absolutely that your body cannot make, and they're called essential amino acids. You only get, for example, with specific foods like meats or so forth. And so, if you're going to be a meat fast, if you're going to, excuse me, yeah, meat fast, if you're going to be a vegetarian, those essential amino acids, you got to make sure you get them in somewhere in your diet.
All right. We do have one question from online. Dan asks, "Is it true that venoms can turn into a protein when they come in contact with electricity?"
Whoa. Yeah, I have to plead ignorance on that. I've not heard of something like that. I'd have to see a scientific publication that would document that in some manner. It sounds interesting, but I'm ignorant on that.
All right. Yes, ma'am. One more question. Do we have a microphone? Yep, coming to you.
I have a question. I have a stepdaughter that has got MS, and she is going downhill almost daily. But you said that tapeworms, pinworms, and tapeworms help prevent the relapses. Do you eat them in a tossed salad or? How? I mean, I've never heard of going to the drugstore and ordering tapeworms. How do you do it?
Yeah, it's purely experimental right now. I quoted from a BBC story in 2007, and so there's still a lot of work to be done, for example. But what they're finding out is people have an amazing ability to live at peace and harmony, if I can use those two words, with parasites. And there was a big study done in the country of India where parasitologists went there to cleanse a population of parasites, and gave the usual drugs and anaphylactic drugs to get rid of parasites, and they found that there was virtually no difference between those that had a what we call a worm burden versus those that were parasite free. And there just didn't seem to be that much of a difference between the two. And so I thought that that was kind of interesting how the body is able to work with that, if I can use that word. But I'm not sure if I understood, Nam, your question exactly. But yeah, it would take quite a bunch of work to, for example, treat somebody who has MS with a potpourri of parasites without having to go through the right channels and all. But the research that was done, the preliminary research, I think looks quite promising. And it goes back to the work that was done in India a few years ago.
Thank you for asking that. I was wondering that very same thing. All right, any other questions? One more. Oh, we got maybe two more. We're going to keep you busy, Dr. Sherwin.
So, as I think about this whole matter, it draws me to God's sovereignty. Would you say, or can you expound on this a little bit, that because of God's sovereignty, He created parasites because of His foreknowledge of the fall?
Oh, okay. There are a group of, there are many Christians that feel that God knew that man would fall, and of course He is sovereign, and He does know, and that some insects, for example, were created to have the genetic machinery that would kick in after the fall, and within their genome. For example, like I can't think of some of the parasites, insects offhand, but that God had, with His foreknowledge of His creation and His sovereignty. That's after Adam and Eve fell and God cursed the earth. That's what happened. And of course, it's hard to say yay or nay in a situation like that. Although, as I say, there are a number of creation scientists who believe that. So that's about all I can say on that subject.
Okay. Yes, sir.
Hello. Yeah, this is just a comment from the things I've heard tonight, which is way over my head as far as all the words and stuff. But it seems like the concept that you said about a parasite, how it affects the immune system. It seems like, the whole thing we've gone through with COVID and viruses, and you just can't put every human and every organism in a box and say this the one thing will be good for that person or will heal them or protect them. It's we're also individually made, and our reactions are so varied to these things. What might be good for one person might be deadly to the other.
Yeah. Okay. And if one of you could just sound off on the question, the basic question on that, because I had trouble hearing that. So,
Yeah, it.
a little louder.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, it really wasn't a question, but just a comment on the things that you've said. Seems like to me that the complexity of the organisms, whether you call them parasites or others, that it's so deep, so just like us as humans, you know, and this COVID thing, the virus, how it affects a person. You know, you just can't put all of humanity into one box and say this is good. We treat it this thing's good for that person. It might be good for some, but it might kill others. So
Yeah.
that seems to be a
Right.
principle.
I agree with you 100%. It all has to do with the individual's physiology and their age and nutrition, and just so many factors you know, fit into all of that as to whether we are able to fight a COVID infection effectively, or we have to, you know, succumb, as it were, tragically, as it happened with millions. And so you're absolutely right. It all has to do with an individual's physiology, their physical ability, you know, how fit they are, as I say, nutrition. But you know, we look at our immune system, and we just see a marvel of complexity in that, and uh, just you know, parasite life cycles. I was describing that Diagenina trematode, which can make physiological changes within quite literally a fraction of a second in order to overcome, or at least to sustain itself in a very hostile environment, like an individual's bloodstream with the immune system and all. So it really is a testament to creation, even though it's the cursed creation.
Great questions. Yes, sir.
You was talking about life cycles. The opossum has a life cycle of a parasite that goes through them, back in the grass, and back through them. But if a horse eats that parasite, it gets into their system, into the nerve system, will kill the horse. So it's interesting how the cycle works for one animal, but does not work for the other animal.
Yeah, absolutely right. And you almost have to take it sometimes at a case by case basis and all. And that gets into something that I wanted to get into, but we didn't have time tonight. And that is how some parasites are able to actually change the behavior of the intermediate host, making it more likely that the definitive or the final host will eat that intermediate host. For example, just a real quick example is there's a parasite that infects birds, but the parasite has found itself on the ground. And how does it get up into a bird? Well, it has to go through, first of all, a snail, and then ants come along and they eat the slime trail of the snail. Well, the slime trail of a snail contains the immature stage of the parasite. When the ants eat the slime trail, they eat the parasite. The parasite is not digested by the ant's digestive system. As a matter of fact, it gets a little more sophisticated. It migrates up to the brain of the ant. We call it the subesophageal ganglion. Ganglion is accumulation of nerve cells. And this parasite changes the behavior of the ant in a way that it makes it more likely for the bird to see the ant. Well, wait a minute. Ants live underground. How is the bird going to get to ant? Well, the answer is when this parasite changes the behavior of the ant, instead of going down into the tunnel, starts walking in circles on a flat rock. And I'm not kidding. It aimlessly walks in a circle on a flat rock. And guess who sees that? The bird. Bird flies down, eats the ant. What's inside the ant? the parasite. And now the parasite finds itself in the what we call the definitive host, the final host, which is the bird. And then it begins to make ova, which are eggs. It sheds the ova out of the bird. The bird poop falls onto the ground and is eaten by the snail. The snail leaves a slime trail. The ants eat the slime trail. Ants get infected. It changes the behavior of the ant and gets back up to the bird. Is that not amazing, or what?
Fascinating. I don't think we're going to top that one. We better stop there. Well, Dr. Frank Sherwin, we want to thank you for joining us. We really appreciate having you and fielding all the questions for us. And we'd like to invite everyone to join us for the next Great Plains Genesis Forum. It's going to be July 11th. So we hope to see you there. Thank you, everyone, for attending, and have a blessed evening.